Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. Glad to have you with me. So, the last couple of episodes, I've talked a lot about economic issues. And the reason I do that is as we get closer and closer to the 2020 election, I think the economy, if you look at the Drudge headlines for the past weekend, for example, we're talking about unemployment that is at 50-year lows. Yet I think many Americans, either willfully or wantonly or just, haphazardly, are really ignorant about economics. And in particular, a lot of that is fed by, in fact, I'll tell you a very quick story. I have very dear friends who are this Jewish couple from New York, and they still have some relatives there. But they've often described, one individual in particular talks about his mother, who gets exclusively her news from the New York Times. If you get all of your news from the New York Times, let's forget about politics for a second. Let's forget about culture. Let's just talk about economics. Because Paul Krugman, the economist in-house for the New York Times, is really one of, in terms of Keynesian economics, is really just one of the most, I think, doofuses around. So it's easy to mock the New York Times for dodgy and inaccurate writing about economics. But to be fair, the paper has some sound journalists who sometimes do a good job, occasionally, and it's just all too rare. But let's not talk about Paul Krugman right now. Instead, let's talk about another economics reporter, and that's David Leonhardt. He actually claims that imposing a wealth tax and taking private capital out of the private sector can actually lead to more economic growth. He writes, there are two problems with the arguments from these opponents. First, they're based on a premise that the American economy is doing just fine and we shouldn't mess with success. Second, he says, it's also plausible that a wealth tax would accelerate economic growth. A large portion of society's resources are held by a tiny slice of people. There's that wealth, inequality. A large portion of society's resources, he says, are held by a tiny slice of people who are not using the resources very efficiently. Sure, he says, it's theoretically possible that some entrepreneurs and investors might work less hard, but it's more likely that any such effect would be small and more than outweighed by the return that the economy would get on the programs that a wealth tax would finance, like education, scientific research, infrastructure, and more. It's amazing to me to see such ignorance in one short paragraph. But let's think about his arguments for a second. His first claim is just utter nonsense. If you've been following the debate over wealth tax for years, and I've run across a critic who argued that the wealth tax is a bad idea because the economy is, quote, doing just fine. But instead, critics invariably explain that the tax is a bad idea because it would exacerbate the tax code's bias against saving and investment and thus have a negative effect on jobs, wages, productivity, competitiveness, all of those things that actually make an economy thrive and grow. And those arguments are true and relevant whether the economy is booming, in a recession, or somewhere in between. His second claim is equally absurd. He wants readers to believe that government spending is good for growth and that those benefits will more than offset the economic harm from a punitive tax. Now, to be fair, at least this is not a make-believe argument. Left-leaning bureaucracies, such as the IMF or the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, have been pushing a wealth tax idea really hard in recent years. They use phrases such as resource mobilization and financing for development to argue that higher taxes will lead to more growth because government somehow will use the money more wisely than the private sector will allocate those resources. But needless to say, that's preposterous. That's an anti-empirical assertion, especially when dealing with a tax that would do lots of damage on a per-dollar collected basis. So let's go back to the New York Times. A news report in the New York Times had a much more rational assessment, largely focusing on the degree of damage such a tax would cause. I know it's the New York Times, but I'll take it when I can get it. They write, progressive Democrats are advocating the most drastic shift in tax policy in over a century as they look to redistribute wealth, with new taxes that could fundamentally reshape the United States economy. Senator Warren of Massachusetts, Bernie Sanders of Vermont, they have both proposed wealth taxes that would shrink the fortunes of the richest Americans. Those two plans envision this enormous transfer of money from the wealthy. The idea of redistributing wealth by targeting billionaires is stirring fierce debates at the highest levels of academia and business. Opponents are arguing that it's going to cripple economic growth, sap the motivation of entrepreneurs who want to become multimillionaires, and set off a search for loopholes. You know, money is a lot like water, in the sense that water is always going to seek its lowest point of equilibrium. Money's always going to seek out ways to preserve itself. And those who have money are going to seek out ways to most efficiently use that money and to use that money to work for itself to make even more money. There was a conference sponsored by the Brookings Institution in September. This Harvard economist, George Mankey, I think is how you pronounce his name, offered a searing critique arguing that a wealth tax would skew incentives that could alter when the super rich make investments, how they give to charity, and even potentially spur a wave of divorces solely for tax purposes. He also noted that billionaires, with their legions of lawyers and accountants, have proven to be absolute experts at gaming the system to avoid even the most onerous taxes. He said, quote, "On the one hand, it's a bad policy. And then the other thing is, it's a feckless policy. Left-leaning economists have expressed their own doubts about a wealth tax. Earlier this year, Larry Sumner, who was President Clinton's Treasury Secretary, warned that wealth taxes would end up sapping innovation by putting new burdens on entrepreneurial businesses at the very point that they are starting up. In their view, he says, a country with more millionaires is a sign of economic vibrancy. Of course it is. And I actually think this is a somewhat good example of actual good economic reporting. It cited supporters and opponents. It fairly represented their arguments. And readers learned that the real debate is over the magnitude of economic harm. So let's go to Bloomberg for a minute. There was a Bloomberg column that explains how much money might get siphoned from the private economy if a wealth tax is imposed. But before we go to that, you've heard me talk a bazillion times about every time a dollar is extracted from the private sector and put into the public sector, that dollar is so ineffectual and so inefficiently used that the value that dollar in the private sector, the value that it could bring, the jobs that it could create, the new technology that it might develop, gets squandered in the bureaucracy first and foremost, and then gets used ineffectively by the bureaucracy because the bureaucracy simply can't do anything effectively, with maybe the exception of the military. But let's go for just a moment to the Bloomberg story. Bloomberg writes this: billionaires such as Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett could have collectively lost hundreds of billions of dollars in net worth over decades if presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax plan had been in effect, and they had done nothing to avoid it. That's according to calculations in a new paper by two French economists who helped her devise the proposed tax on the wealthiest Americans. the top 15 richest Americans would have seen their net worth decline by more than half to $433.9 billion had Warren's plan been in place since 1982, according to the paper by the University of California, Berkeley professors Emmanuel Saz and Gabriel Zuckman. The calculations underscore how a wealth tax of just a few percentage points might erode fortunes over time. What matters to the economy, though, is not the amount of wealth owned by individual entrepreneurs. Instead, it's the amount of saving and investment. In other words, the stock of capital in the economy. The reason a wealth tax is bad news is because it diverts capital from the private sector, transfers it to Washington, where politicians and the bureaucracy will end up squandering the funds, notwithstanding anybody in the New York Times hopes that it might be spent well. Every time I hear anybody talk about we need a government program to do X because it can do X more effectively, or it's going to reduce income inequality, or it's going to, because millionaires and billionaires are bad, it just infuriates me. Anyone who knows millionaires and billionaires know that they invest that money. They want that money to grow. They want it to work for them. How do they do that? They put that money into startup companies, or maybe they put it into a mutual fund. They put it into a bank that makes mortgages. They put it into a real estate investment trust. They put it into any number of investment vehicles where that money then gets turned over so it can do some good. If you take that same dollar or that same $1 billion, I don't care whatever it is, and you give it to the government, what's going to happen to it? It's going to be squandered. It's going to be wasted. It's not going to go to the creation of jobs. And how anybody can believe that somehow creating a wealth tax and taking money away from the wealthy is going to make you or me richer is absolutely crazy. Think about all of them. Think about it this way. Those of you who are about to turn 65, or maybe your retirement age is 66, whatever it happens to be for Social Security. 65, you start taking Medicare. Can you imagine if you were able to take all of that money, even with the ups and downs of the stock market, and you had invested it in something really safe, and it had grown and compounded that interest over your entire lifetime? If you're like me, you started working when you were 18, doing odd jobs or whatever. I started paying Social Security taxes back when I think I was maybe 16 years old. If I had had all of that money, even invested just in CDs or something, my return on investment would be so much more than what it is now. And why is that? Because the money that we pay in as taxes, whether it's Medicaid tax, a Medicare tax, Social Security taxes, payroll taxes, whatever it is, always gets squandered. So beware the wealth tax. It may be populist and it may be popular to demean millionaires and billionaires. But you know what? Millionaires and billionaires are the ones that take their wealth and invest it and put it to good use. Those people who are living paycheck to paycheck or who have no money to invest, they're not doing anything other than buying goods and services that they'd be buying anyway. They're not growing the economy. They're simply barely sustaining the economy. I'll be right back. I have to get to a doctor's appointment pretty quickly, so I want to. This will be a somewhat short episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. But there were two completely different stories on the Sunday news shows that I think show the battle that I tried to describe in earlier podcasts and on the radio program about what's really going on with impeachment. The first occurred Sunday on This Week with George Stephanopoulos, in which ABC's Jonathan Karl, says that the White House has absolutely no intention of cooperating with the subpoenas unless Nancy Pelosi formally opens an impeachment inquiry, which would require a vote of the House members.
A week of head-snapping developments in the impeachment investigation. The first key witness testimony to Congress. The first release of text messages from administration officials broadly confirming the pressure campaign on Ukraine outlined in the original whistleblower complaint. That brazen public request from President Trump calling on China to investigate Joe Biden. Late Friday, the first subpoenas to the White House, plus a new request for documents from Vice President Pence. And this morning, more breaking news. ABC News has learned that the legal team representing the first whistleblower is now representing a second whistleblower. Attorney Mark Zaid told me that this second whistleblower is a member of the intelligence community with firsthand information on some of the allegations at issue. The second whistleblower has been interviewed by the Inspector General, and his attorneys say they have the full protection of the whistleblower law because they provided information directly to the Inspector General. The second whistleblower has not yet communicated directly with the congressional committees conducting this investigation. I want to dig into this with our chief White House correspondent, John Karl, our chief justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas. And Pierre, under this reading of the law, several other officials could claim whistleblower protections.
George, this is critical. We know from the whistleblower's initial complaint that there were at least 6 other people that he was gathering information from.
I got to pause it for a moment. The breathlessness with which they report this. There are whistleblowers in Washington, D.C. all the time. But they make it sound as if this is something really unusual and that the whistleblower, because the whistleblower and now the second whistleblower has talked to the Inspector General, I guess, with the CIA or the Director of National Intelligence, that somehow this gives credence to the whistleblower's case. It doesn't. The only thing that the statute does in terms of the whistleblower is it gives them certain civil service protections and enables them to present their case, due process of law, but it doesn't add any credibility to the whistleblower's case. It simply means that an individual has come forward with what they believe is wrongdoing, unethical behavior, illegal behavior, immoral behavior, and that under the whistleblower statute, they're entitled to certain civil service protections and certain due process rights. That's all it means. So everybody, take a deep breath. A whistleblower is a whistleblower, and it is language that is simply meant to inflame the ignorant masses that, oh my gosh, there's a whistleblower, so it must be true and there must be something awful going on. No, not at all.
You have the potential that those people could be witnesses coming before Congress. And George, what is key here? These are people who can not only corroborate the whistleblower's account, but they can add layers of additional detail.
And some firsthand information, according to Mark Zaid right there. John Karl, President Trump was tweeting about the possibility of a second whistleblower last night.
He sure was, George. We've reached out with this latest news. The official comment from the White House is no comment. But late last night, the president did tweet about reports there might be a second whistleblower, saying the first so-called secondhand information whistleblower got my phone conversation almost completely wrong. So now word is they are going to the bench and another whistleblower is coming in from deep state, also with secondhand info. Meet with Shifty, keep them coming. Now, George, a couple of quick fact checks on this. First of all, as you just reported, we are told that this second whistleblower, in fact, had firsthand information, not secondhand information. And the second thing is the first whistleblower's complaint turned out to be quite consistent with what we know about the call based on the transcript, reconstructed transcript released by the White House.
And John,
the reconstructed transcript, I still don't see a quid pro quo in any of the transcripts. But here's the point. So now you have Jonathan Karl saying that, look, we now have a second whistleblower. The White House has no intention of cooperating unless Nancy Pelosi fully cooperates by opening a formal impeachment inquiry. Back to Jonathan Karl.
As you just reported, we are told that this second whistleblower, in fact, had firsthand information, not secondhand information. And the second thing is the first whistleblower's complaint turned out to be quite consistent with what we know about the call based on the transcript, reconstructed transcript released by the White House.
And, John, the president may have been responding to that New York Times report about the possibility of a second whistleblower that came out on Friday. But Mark Zaid, the attorney, told me he doesn't even know if his client is the whistleblower referred to in the New York Times. Meantime, the White House is seeming to defy the subpoena from Congress.
Absolutely, George. What I am told from senior officials is the White House has absolutely no intention of cooperating with the congressional committees on this unless Nancy Pelosi first holds a vote formally opening an impeachment inquiry. Here's the way one White House official told me, put it to me. You don't get to have an impeachment by holding a press conference. We are not going to participate in a show trial. What officials are saying is, without a formal vote by the House, the White House is deprived certain rights they would have in an impeachment process, including the right to have White House counsel present at all depositions by congressional committees.
Amen. And that is exactly right. So let's go back. So if that's the case, and the White House isn't going to cooperate because there has been no formal vote on an impeachment inquiry, why do you think that is? I think it's quite simple. Because if Nancy Pelosi were to hold an impeachment inquiry vote, there's no guarantee it would pass. There's no guarantee that even if it did pass, that anything's going to happen in the Senate anyway. Mitch McConnell has already said it's going to be a very quick trial. Senators are, with maybe the exception of Mitt Romney, are not going to vote to convict Donald Trump on these flimsy grounds. But the reason there hasn't been a formal impeachment inquiry vote, I think, is quite simple. Josh Holmes was on Fox News Sunday and explained why.
Is not going to be well served by this process.
We ask you, just picking up on this, we ask you for questions for the panel. And on the issue of the Nancy Pelosi's decision not to hold a formal vote to launch this probe, we got this on Twitter from Nurse Gwendo. I am a Democrat, and I am for an impeachment inquiry. I don't understand why the Democrats don't want to vote. I believe Americans want to see the vote. Josh, following up on Nurse Gwendo, the White House is apparently going to refuse to release documents to comply with the subpoena based on the argument that it is challenging the House to hold a formal impeachment vote. Do you think they can turn this into a debate over process?
Well, sure, I think they can.
And before we go, I should point out that Josh Holmes is the former chief of staff to Senator Mitch McConnell.
Democrats have largely made it a debate over process. I mean, look, that nurse has an absolutely excellent point. What Nancy Pelosi has been trying to do for the better part of 2 years, and actually since they won the majority in the House in 2018, is to try to deflect and distract the base of her party and the base of her conference away from impeachment because she knows the politics are no good. Now, they had to get there one way or another. I would argue that it was inevitable. They were going to find a reason to justify this one way or another. But she does not want, on the front end of all of this, to put all of those moderate House Democrats, those freshmen who are in purple and red districts, on the record on the front end of an impeachment inquiry to try to convict this president. It is horrible politics for her. It is horrible politics for that conference. And I think she could lose the majority if she went down that road.
And I think that's exactly the reason why they haven't held a vote on the impeachment inquiry. They know it's bad politics. They know that an impeachment inquiry vote, whether it passes or doesn't pass, the mere fact of holding a vote about whether or not to open an impeachment inquiry on Donald Trump will fire up the base like nobody has ever seen. Now, granted, it will fire up the base of those on the progressive left also, but that's not what counts. What counts are all of those congressional critters in all of those swing districts, all of those moderate districts, and even in those red districts. That's why she won't hold the vote. That's the game that's being played. And I think the president is absolutely right in saying, we're not going to comply with subpoenas. We're not going to participate in this process. If you're going to impeach me, then you need to have a formal impeachment vote. And at that point, we'll send White House counsel over, we'll send impeachment counsel over, and we will start engaging in the process. Until then, #bite me. Thanks for listening to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. We'll see how it plays out this week, but I think that what we will continue to hear and see is a whole bunch of noise. And as we go through this noise, I'll try to point out, best I can, the politics of what's really going on behind the scenes. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.